Welcome, my dear friends, to another journey into the heart of mystery. Tonight, we open the pages of Miss Marple and the funeral that never ended, a tale where the hush of a village church hides more than sorrow. Imagine it, the autumn air crisp, a fire crackling in the grate, and a cup of tea warming your hands as the story begins. But tell me, what's your favorite setting for sinking into a mystery? An autumn evening, a snowy winter's night, or perhaps a long summer afternoon? Share your thoughts below, and let's begin. The morning mist clung to the crooked gravestones of St. Mary Mead, curling like pale fingers through the churchyard. Villagers shuffled in, black coats buttoned tight against the chill, hats lowered in solemn respect. At the center of it all lay the coffin, polished but untouched, as though waiting for a moment that refused to arrive. The service should have begun hours ago, yet once again it was delayed. Whispers rustled more loudly than the wind, some muttering of illness, others of forgotten papers, and one bold voice daring to wonder if the man inside was truly who they thought. Bouquets that had once been fresh now sagged, petals drooping in defeat. The vicar, pale and restless, adjusted his notes but made no move to step forward. Among the pews, Miss Marple sat with her usual gentle poise, knitting bag at her side, eyes sharper than any detective's. She noticed the widow's hands trembling, the gravedigger avoiding her gaze, and a stranger lurking near the back. To most, it was simply another village funeral gone strangely awry. To Miss Marple, however, it was the beginning of something far darker than grief. For in St. Mary Mead, even death rarely tells the whole truth. Chapter 1. Shadows over St. Mary Mead. Morning in St. Mary Mead always carried a sense of calm that seemed untouched by the wider world. The grocer's bell jingled cheerfully, bicycles leaned against cottage gates, and conversations meandered between recipes and roses. Over at Mrs. Hartnell's shop, a small knot of villagers clustered near the counter, exchanging tidbits of gossip with the same vigor others might reserve for politics. The subject, inevitably, was the funeral that refused to take place. "Oh, I hear it's some dreadful paperwork business," Mrs. Price announced, pursing her lips as she selected her bread. "Delays from London, no doubt. Bureaucracy, always bureaucracy." But Miss Marple, who stood quietly by the preserved shelf, noticed how Mrs. Price's eyes flicked nervously toward the churchyard as she spoke. Even the grocer, usually so unflappable, dropped a potato, fumbling as though startled by the topic. Outwardly, the village appeared its usual picture of tranquility, teacups clinking, children skipping rope, roses blooming against whitewashed walls. Yet under that calm surface, there was strain. Faces held a little too long in polite smiles. Silences stretched a fraction past comfortable. To most, the delay of a funeral was a mere curiosity, fodder for chatter over tea. But to Miss Marple, who understood the language of small gestures, there was a different truth. Something lay unsettled beneath the village's peaceful surface, something no one quite dared to name. The widow, Mrs. Alders, had become a figure of fascination in the days following her husband's supposed death. She was a slight woman with pale, fine features, always dressed in muted grays that seemed to drain the light from a room. Villagers, brimming with sympathy, stopped by her cottage with pies, flowers, and endless condolences. She received them graciously, yet there was something about her manner that stirred unease. Her hands, for one, could never quite keep still. When pouring tea, the china rattled against its saucer. When folding her handkerchief, the fabric twisted and turned as if wrung by unseen worries. To the sympathetic eye, it was grief, raw, consuming, and heavy. But Miss Marple, who had sat quietly by the fire during one such visit, saw something else entirely, not grief, but dread. Mrs. Alder's gaze slid away too quickly when the funeral was mentioned. Her shoulders tightened whenever her late husband's name passed another's lips. Even her polite smile seemed strained, stitched on like embroidery over fraying cloth. The village excused it. Of course the poor woman was distressed. But Miss Marple knew better. There was a peculiar quality to fear that no black veil could hide. And in Mrs. Alder's trembling hands, that fear was written as plainly as words in a book. By the third postponement, the churchyard itself had become a gathering place for speculation. Villagers lingered after services, leaning against weathered gravestones, whispering in tones that carried far more eagerness than sorrow. The coffin sat sealed within the church, and its continued presence gave rise to theories that multiplied faster than daisies in spring. "It's the lawyers, I tell you," muttered old Mr. Pritchard, squinting through his spectacles. "They found some clause in the will. I shouldn't wonder. Money delays everything." "Nonsense," countered Mrs. Bartlett, whose voice had a sharp edge. "It's the body. Mark my words, there's something not right in that coffin. Why else would the vicar keep putting it off?" Gasps and nervous laughter followed, but no one openly contradicted her. Even the gravedigger, passing with his shovel, kept his head lowered and offered no greeting. His silence was more unsettling than rumor itself. Miss Marple stood apart, her knitting needles poised in her lap, listening without appearing to. She noted how quickly stories spread, how fear fed invention, and how every whisper pointed not to sorrow, but suspicion. Funerals were meant to bring closure, to still the restless air of gossip. Yet the opposite was true. With every delay, unease deepened. And though the villagers cloaked their curiosity in chatter, Miss Marple could see it plainly in their eyes. Beneath their speculation lay a shared, unspoken dread. Miss Marple had long since learned that the smallest details often revealed the greatest truths. While others busied themselves with chatter, her eyes lingered on the quiet, overlooked corners of the scene. She noticed, for instance, the gravedigger's fingernails, dark with fresh soil though no grave had yet been opened. His face flushed when she caught his eye, and he turned away too quickly, muttering about tools. Then there was the young man who lingered at the church gate, hat pulled low, watching the mourners with an intensity that felt less like grief and more like calculation. He never entered, never spoke, yet his presence was as constant as the coffin itself. And, most telling of all, the widow's glances. Time and again, Miss Marple observed her eyes flick toward the coffin, not in mourning, but with something closer to fear, as though the polished wood itself threatened her. To most, these fragments were invisible, dismissed as quirks of sorrow or village habit. But Miss Marple stitched them together as neatly as one of her knitted scarves. A coffin that would not be buried, a widow who feared its contents, a gravedigger with dirt he should not have. It was enough to prick her curiosity. And when Miss Marple's curiosity was pricked, mysteries rarely remained hidden for long. Chapter 2. Whispers of the Dead. The undertaker, Mr. Holloway, was a man of precise habits. For years he attended to the village's solemn duties with quiet efficiency, never late, never flustered, always respectful. And so, when he failed to appear on the morning of the rescheduled funeral, the absence struck the villagers like a sour note in a hymn. The vicar cleared his throat and offered vague reassurances. Perhaps Mr. Holloway had been delayed on the road. Perhaps illness had kept him abed. But whispers spread swiftly. The undertaker had been seen locking the vestry late the night before, coffin keys jangling in his hand. Since then, not a soul had laid eyes on him. By afternoon, speculation had grown into something darker. "Run off with the widow's money," suggested one wag. Or wise, perhaps he never left the church at all. A few villagers glanced uneasily toward the heavy oak doors, as though half expecting to hear a muffled knock from within. Miss Marple, who sipped her tea at the back of the church hall, allowed the gossip to wash over her. She recalled, with a shiver, other mysteries in which disappearance was not absence but silence, a calculated way to keep questions unanswered. Mr. Holloway's vanishing, so sudden and so neatly timed, was not the clumsy act of misfortune. It was, she felt certain, part of a design. And in St. Mary Mead, designs of that kind were rarely innocent. It was the verger who stumbled upon it first, a slim, leather-bound ledger tucked behind hymnals in the vestry cupboard. He assumed it to be parish accounts, until a careless glance revealed that the neat columns of ink had nothing to do with offerings or church repairs. Curious, he brought it to the vicar, who blanched at the sight of names, dates, and figures scrawled in a hand that was careful, deliberate, and unfamiliar. Word of the discovery spread in hushed tones, until it reached Miss Marple's attentive ears. With quiet politeness, she asked to see the book. The man, half relieved to hand it off, obliged. She adjusted her spectacles, turning the pages slowly, her expression unreadable. The entries were not merely records of debts. There were secrets, each note written in a code of initials and discreet hints. More troubling still, she found the name of the deceased himself, circled more than once, with cryptic notations beside it, account closed, final payment, and beneath, a symbol resembling a cross. The air in the vestry grew heavier as Miss Marple closed the ledger. To the villagers, it seemed a curiosity, perhaps proof of shady dealings best left unspoken. To Miss Marple, it was something far more telling. These were the ledgers of a man who traded not in goods, but in secrets, secrets that bound others in chains of silence. And if the coffin in the church did not contain the man it was said to, then someone had a very good reason to keep those secrets buried. Not long after the ledger was found, a stranger appeared in St. Mary Mead. He arrived with little fanfare, stepping off the afternoon coach with a battered suitcase and a dark hat pulled low. At the inn, he gave his name, Mr. Collins, and explained he was a distant relative of the deceased, come to pay his respects. His story was accepted politely enough, for English villages are courteous by nature. Yet even courtesy could not smother curiosity. Mr. Collins carried himself with a quiet reserve, speaking in clipped tones that seemed carefully chosen. His accent was English, but with peculiar turns that did not quite belong to the countryside, nor to London. When asked about his connection to the dead man, his answers were vague, a cousin through marriage, long estranged. Still, he showed no wish to see the coffin, no desire to comfort the widow. Instead, he kept to the corner of the inn, sipping ale, eyes scanning the room with restless calculation. Miss Marple, who happened to take tea there one afternoon, observed the stranger's manner without appearing to do so. He flinched when villagers spoke of the funeral delays, and once, when the gravedigger entered, his hand tightened visibly around his glass. Such details might pass unnoticed by most, but not by her. For all his careful politeness, Mr. Collins did not look like a man come to mourn. He looked like a man watching and waiting. For what? Miss Marple could not yet say, but she knew with certainty his arrival was no coincidence. Chapter 3. Beneath the coffin lid. The villagers, weary of delays, decided to hold a candlelight vigil in the church one damp evening. Rows of flickering flames glowed softly, casting long shadows across the stone walls, as hymns were murmured under breath. It was meant as an act of patience, of unity, a way to remind themselves that grief deserved closure, even if the funeral could not yet be done. For a while, the hush was reverent, broken only by the creak of pews and the rustle of coats. Then, without warning, a scream tore through the silence. Mrs. Bartlett, who had leaned too near the coffin, staggered back, hand clutched to her throat. The lid, polished and solemn, was not quite as it had been. It seemed disturbed, shifted ever so slightly, as though prized open and hastily closed again. Gasps swept through the church, some insisting it was imagination, others swearing they had seen the wood move. The vicar paled, fumbling to restore calm, but his voice trembled more than the candles. Miss Marple did not scream. She sat very still, eyes narrowing, noting every face in the wavering light. Fear had rippled through the room. Yes, but guilt and knowledge had flickered in just a few, and she filed those glances away. By morning, the vigil had become the sole topic of village gossip. Housewives leaned over garden gates, tradesmen paused mid-delivery, and every whispered exchange carried the same refrain: "The coffin is not right." Some swore they had heard a hollow sound when Mrs. Bartlett knocked against it. Others claimed they saw the lid quiver, though no hand touched it. A few, bolder still, declared outright that the man inside was not the man they had come to bury. The vicar, mortified by the rumors, attempted to quash them, speaking of nerves and overwrought imaginations. Yet his voice wavered, and the villagers noticed. The more he denied, the more the whispers grew. Fear, once seated, thrives in silence. Miss Marple, meanwhile, busied herself with small, precise observations. She had glanced at the body during its brief viewing, noting the cut of the suit, newer than one the deceased had owned. She remembered the glint of a ring on his finger, a gaudy piece that the man, so modest in life, would never have chosen. And there was the hairline, ever so slightly different, as though age and years of habit had not shaped it in quite the same way. Alone, these details might seem trifles. Together, they formed the outline of a troubling thought, that the coffin contained not a villager at all, but a stranger. And if that were so, then the question pressing itself upon Miss Marple's mind was clear. Where, then, was the rightful body? Miss Marple never relied on bold declarations. She preferred the quiet gathering of proof. In the days that followed, she set about her subtle investigations with the air of a woman attending to errands. At the parish office, she asked to see old records, births, marriages, burials, ostensibly for a family friend tracing a genealogy. The clerk thought little of it, but Miss Marple carefully compared signatures, noting how the deceased had once signed his name in a flowing hand, quite unlike the cramped scrawl on recent papers. Later, at a village tea, she asked casually after photographs. Mrs. Price obligingly fetched a wedding portrait, the deceased smiling stiffly in a modest suit. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the man's plain ring finger, unadorned by jewelry of any kind, a detail so ordinary it had passed unnoticed, until now, when she recalled the corpse's ornate ring gleaming defiantly in the coffin. Even at the draper's, she inquired about suits, learning the deceased had not purchased new clothing in years. The garment on the body was not only fresh, but finely stitched, London-made. Each clue was a thread, and Miss Marple wove them together with patient precision. The pattern was undeniable. Whoever rested in that coffin, it was not the villager they mourned. The question was no longer if, but why. One evening, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Alder's cottage. The lamps were low, the fire dim, and the widow sat hunched in her chair as though the weight of the world pressed upon her shoulders. At first, their talk was of ordinary things, the weather, the garden, the kindness of neighbors. But Miss Marple's gentle questions, softly placed, soon steered the conversation toward her late husband. Mrs. Alder's hands trembled on her teacup. Finally, with a broken sigh, she admitted what she had never dared to say aloud. Her husband's past had not been clean. He had carried debts, both financial and moral, that stretched back years. She had lived in fear of the day they would come due. But I never wished him harm, she whispered fiercely, eyes shining with unshed tears. I only prayed the truth would remain hidden. Miss Marple listened with quiet compassion, yet her mind turned to the coffin resting still in the church. "My day," she said softly, "if not your husband in that box, then whose poor soul is it we mourn?" The widow lowered her gaze, and the silence that followed was darker than any grief. Chapter 4. The Web Titans. The man calling himself Mr. Collins had, by now, settled uneasily into village life. He spent hours at the inn, exchanged stiff pleasantries, yet offered no true account of himself. Such vagueness did not sit well with Miss Marple. Quietly, she began her inquiries. A word here with the innkeeper about his habits, a question there with the postmistress regarding the letters he sent. Small things, asked in such a natural way that no one thought twice of it. The picture that emerged was peculiar. Mr. Collins received no correspondence, though he pretended to expect it. He paid his bill in crisp notes, oddly new for a man who claimed long estrangement from family wealth. His papers, shown once, briefly, bore stamps and signatures, yet to Miss Marple's sharp eyes, they seemed too freshly inked, lacking the faint wear of genuine documents. When she inquired discreetly in the next village, no one had heard of him, though he claimed to have come from there. His name, it seemed, was as rootless as his story. Such men did not drift idly into St. Mary Mead. They came with purpose, and as Miss Marple tucked her knitting away that evening, she wondered whose purpose this stranger truly served. Reverend Harper was a good man, but good men often carry their secrets poorly. In the days after the vigil, his face grew wan, his hands restless with the hymnals, and his sermons drifted into confusion. At last, during an evening visit to the rectory, Miss Marple found him pacing before the fire, eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "My dear lady," he confessed, voice strained, "I could not in good conscience allow the service to proceed. I have delayed it deliberately." His hands trembled as though he expected judgment. "From the moment the coffin was brought here, I felt something amiss. It is not my place to question death, yet each time I stood ready to read the rites, my heart failed me. I was certain, that inside was not the man I had baptized, married, and served beside for 20 years. He wrung his hands, whispering of scandal, of the shame that might ruin the parish. If word spread that the church itself had presided over a deception, faith would wither in the very soil of St. Mary Mead. Better, he thought, to delay, to hope the matter might quietly resolve itself. Miss Marple listened kindly, but her eyes softened with something sterner than pity. Fear, she knew, often bred silence, and silence allowed wickedness to thrive. "My dear Reverend," she said gently, "truth cannot be buried, no matter how deep the grave." The vicar lowered his head, as though absolution might never come. The churchyard was never a place of comfort after dark. Under the heavy branches of the old yew, shadows pooled thick as ink, and the silence pressed upon the ears like a weight. Yet there, near midnight, Miss Marple returned, escorted by young Mr. Clement, the curate, who had reluctantly agreed to accompany her. She insisted it was not morbid curiosity but necessity, and her tone left little room for protest. Lantern light flickered across crooked stones as they moved toward the far end of the grounds. It was there, by instinct more than chance, that Miss Marple paused. The soil beneath the yew was uneven, recently disturbed, though no grave had been marked there. The earth was loose, darker than its surroundings, as though turned with a hurried spade. Mr. Clement muttered uneasily of animals, of storms, of natural causes. But Miss Marple shook her head, stooping to brush the earth with her gloved hand. No fox, no badger, she observed, could bury with such intent. This was the work of human hands, and recent ones at that. As the lantern guttered, a chill ran through the curate. To him, it was a fearful omen. To Miss Marple, it was confirmation. A second grave existed in St. Mary Mead, unmarked, unseen, and perhaps holding the truth the coffin in the church sought to hide. The ledger, once tucked discreetly in the vestry, had become a quiet obsession among the villagers. Some swore they had glimpsed their own initials inside. Others whispered that it contained sins better left forgotten. But when Miss Marple returned one afternoon, spectacles polished and questions ready, the shelf where it had lain was bare. The verger shook his head helplessly. He had not touched it. The vicar, pale as parchment, claimed no knowledge of its removal. Miss Marple did not doubt them. She had expected as much. Secrets, once threatened with exposure, rarely sit still. Someone had recognized the danger of those neat, damning entries, and had acted swiftly to keep them hidden. She retraced her steps in thought. Who had last handled it? Who had lingered in the vestry? Who had been too curious by half? A ledger does not simply vanish, she reflected. It is taken by someone with much to lose. And if the ledger was gone, then its thief understood precisely what she, Miss Marple, had begun to suspect. Which meant, of course, that the game was no longer hers alone to play. The other side was moving. Chapter 5, Unmasking the Truth. By the time the autumn sun dipped low behind the roofs of St. Mary Mead, word had spread like wildfire. The vicar had called a special meeting in the parish hall. One by one, villagers shuffled in, shopkeepers with flowers still on their aprons, farmers smelling of the fields, widows in black shawls, and children hushed by the solemn air. The wooden hall creaked with the weight of bodies and expectation. Miss Marple sat quietly at the back, her knitting bag at her side, eyes darting gently from face to face. She saw tension written in the set of Mrs. Price Ridley's jaw, in the nervous tapping of Mr. Archer's cane, in the way young Clara Simmons avoided meeting anyone's gaze. The village, ordinarily united in small quarrels and shared tea, seemed split by an invisible line of suspicion. The vicar, pale but resolute, took the lectern. His voice wavered at first, but steadied as he spoke of duty, truth, and the shadow that hung over their community. He did not yet reveal what Miss Marple knew, but the air was thick with the knowledge that something grave was about to surface. And as the crowd leaned forward, breaths held, Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, counting the moments until silence gave way to revelation. The parish hall was so still that even the ticking clock on the far wall seemed to thunder. The vicar's speech faltered, his gaze lowering to the worn wood of the lectern. At that moment, Miss Marple rose. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped forward, her knitting needles tucked away, her voice carrying with the quiet firmness of one who speaks only when certain. "My friends," she began, "a funeral has hung over this village like a cloud that will not pass. But what lies within that coffin is not merely a body, it is a question. And tonight, I believe we must face its answer." Gasps rippled through the hall. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her handkerchief, while Mr. Archer's cane tapped the floor with nervous insistence. Miss Marple's eyes swept the crowd, settling at last on one figure who shrank under her gaze. "You have all felt the unease," she continued, her tone neither accusing nor cruel. "But unease rarely deceives us. It was not grief that delayed the service, nor error, nor superstition. It was fear that we would discover the coffin carried not the man we thought, but another altogether." The room erupted, half in disbelief, half in certainty. Whispers tangled into arguments, questions darting like arrows. But Miss Marple's calm presence held the room in check. She did not yet name the guilty, nor did she need to. The guilty knew, and their trembling, paling face betrayed them before a word could be spoken. The following morning, the church was fuller than it had been in years. Word of Miss Marple's revelation had swept across St. Mary Mead like fire in dry grass. Villagers pressed into the pews, their breath misting in the chill air, each face taut with anticipation. The coffin, once the source of endless delay, rested again at the front, draped in solemn black. Yet this time, no one trusted the silence around it. The vicar's hands trembled as he opened the service, his voice quivering with psalms. But before the final blessing could be uttered, Miss Marple stepped forward. Her slight figure, framed against the tall arched windows, seemed almost fragile. Yet when she spoke, her words carried the weight of iron. "This coffin," she said, "has been paraded before us, but hidden within it lies a truth far graver than any of us wished to admit. For it is not John Hayward, as we were told, who rests here." A stunned murmur spread through the church. Gasps, cries, even a fainting spell from the back row punctuated her pause. At her nod, the verger and two strong men pried open the lid. The heavy creak of what seemed to echo forever. And there, among wilted flowers and decaying satin, lay not John Hayward, but the unmistakable remains of his estranged brother, Samuel. The church erupted. Some cried out in horror, others whispered of curses, and a few crossed themselves fervently. But Miss Marple did not flinch. Her eyes sought the pale, trembling figure in the third pew, the one person who had gained everything from Samuel's disappearance, and who had wagered the village's blindness would keep the secret buried forever. Now, exposed before all, that wager had been lost. The congregation had barely regained its breath when Miss Marple raised a hand, calling for quiet. The church, once filled with murmurs of shock and fear, fell into a tense hush. Every eye turned toward her, waiting for the small, sharp woman to untangle the web of deceit that had bound the village in uncertainty. "My friends," she began, her voice soft yet resolute, "we have witnessed a deception that has lasted far too long. John Hayward, the man we believed dead, was indeed alive until his disappearance. But the coffin before you contained Samuel Hayward, his estranged brother. Why? Because John had enemies, and Samuel, well, Samuel's life was collateral in a plan of greed and fear." She moved slowly down the aisle, her gaze sweeping the faces of the villagers. The ledger found in the vestry revealed the truth. It contained names, sums, and subtle markings, indications of debts and threats, not ordinary accounts. Someone wished to conceal these secrets, believing a false death would silence discovery. A hush fell as she turned toward the stranger who had arrived under the guise of Mr. Collins. "And you," she said, voice calm but piercing, "came to claim what you thought was your due, unaware that others had been watching. The coffin, disturbed during the vigil, signaled your anxiety. Every glance, every twitch, betrayed your knowledge of what should have remained hidden." She paused, letting her words settle. And the widow, though she feared exposure, she acted out of caution, not cruelty. Her silence was fear, not complicity. Miss Marple's eyes softened as they met Mrs. Alder's. But the truth, as it always does, comes to light. By the time she finished, the village understood. The coffin had been a mask, the ledger a guide, and the fears of St. Mary Mead had been grounded in real danger. Yet, under the soft glow of the church windows, there was relief, for the mystery was untangled, and the guilty could be held to account. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the echoes of the recent revelations lingered like morning mist over the fields. Children ran through the lanes, their laughter weaving a fragile thread of normalcy through the quiet, but the adults carried with them a deeper awareness. They moved with care, casting glances toward the church, the cemetery, and each other, reminded that even the most peaceful villages can harbor secrets beneath the surface. Miss Marple, as always, returned to her modest cottage at the edge of the village. The familiar creak of the gate, the scent of lavender spilling from the garden, and the steady warmth of her hearth greeted her with comforting familiarity. She set the kettle on, listening to its soft whistle as she poured herself a cup of tea, letting the steam rise and curl in the lamplight. Tea, she knew, had a remarkable way of quieting the mind, offering clarity after the storm. Yet clarity, Miss Marple reflected, did not always bring comfort. The villagers had been forced to confront truths they might have preferred to ignore. The body in the coffin, the missing ledger, the stranger who had walked among them with hidden motives. People, she thought, are often adept at masking their intentions, and fear can keep the most dangerous secrets buried. But fear, no matter how cunning, can never outwit observation, patience, or understanding. As she sipped her tea, Miss Marple considered each face in the parish hall, each gesture she had noted during the vigil, and the ledger's careful entries. Every detail, however small, had contributed to unraveling the mystery. A crooked glance, a hesitation in speech, a trembling hand. These were the breadcrumbs leading to truth. And she smiled faintly, as she often did, at the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice, or at least understanding, restored. Even in peaceful villages like St. Mary Mead, evil and misfortune may come disguised as ordinary events. But for those willing to observe, to notice the small signs, and to listen when others turn away, the truth is never truly lost. It waits quietly for the right mind to uncover it, as patient as the seasons and as inexorable as time itself. And now, dear listener, as we leave St. Mary Mead with its fires lit and streets returning to familiar calm, consider this. What small detail in your own surroundings might hold a story untold? What quiet observation could reveal a hidden truth, if only noticed? If you've enjoyed stepping into the world of Miss Marple, do share your thoughts in the comments. Which moment surprised you most? Who did you suspect first? And if you love these tales as much as we do, subscribe and join us again for another journey into quiet villages, curious mysteries, and the subtle brilliance of observation. There will always be another secret, another clue, another story waiting just beyond the veil of ordinary life.